Next up, we have Sean Sweeney. Sean Sweeney is the coordinator of Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, a global multi-sector network of 47 unions from 16 countries working to advance democratic direction and social ownership of energy. Sean also directs the recently launched International Program for Labor, Climate, and Environment at the Murphy Institute of CUNY.
It takes a lot to put these kind of meetings together. What I want to talk about a little bit is, well, first of all, to acknowledge the level of activism that's going on. I think it's astonishing what has happened in recent years. I remember sitting in a meeting in June 2011 with some indigenous people, Naomi Klein, and we were talking about the Keystone Pipeline. I've been following energy and climate issues for almost 6 or 7 years quite closely. I'd never even heard of the project. I knew about the tar sands. And what happened after that, everybody knows. I mean, that movement erupted, and the done deal was undone. And we're now seeing the Keystoneization. There was an article in the Times saying that everywhere now pipelines are being contested. And it's not just pipelines, fossil fuel infrastructure projects all over North America. But it's also a global phenomenon. I want to touch a little bit on that, just give a little summary of some of the things that are going on. I also want to acknowledge that energy democracy is part of the new narrative. This wasn't a term that was widely used among activists 3 or 4 years ago. I confess, when we launched Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, I'm embarrassed to say, I actually thought of the term energy democracy. And this is true. I thought, hey, that sounds like a good term. Then I Googled it and realized everybody else was talking about it. But we went along with it anyway. But it was still very much on the periphery of conversation. People weren't using the phrase. And there's a reason, I think, why energy democracy is being used, which I'll return to that in a moment. I think, though, what we have to do as a movement is to be more critically engaged in the programmatic side of energy and climate. I sensed even in the discussion now, there's a fantastic celebration of what's going on and the successes. But I think there's some confusion about what we mean by energy democracy and democratic control. And I wanted to put a few thoughts in your mind and maybe open up a discussion about that towards the end. I'll just share an anecdote. I was up in Vermont at a meeting with Bill McKibben just over a year ago. And I said, Bill, so how are you going to get to 350 parts per million? And he said, oh, there are many different ways of doing it. I said, well, just tell me, give me the sort of main outline. How's it going to happen? I said, it's a huge task to reduce emissions to the point where we can stabilize global warming to below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And he's a great guy. I have enormous respect for him. But he said, I'm not a policy guy. I'm an activist. I'm a writer, really. I want to get people moving on this issue. And I felt we're all a bit like that. There's the wonks on one side who study trends and carbon, and then there's the activists who fight fossil fuels. And I think we need to try to pull ourselves a little bit together so that the activists who are engaged in this movement also need to know the enormity of the task we face. Because if we take the science seriously, we have to take the solutions seriously. And incremental steps, small steps, are no longer sufficient. They never were. What illustrates this, of course, is the Paris Agreement. I don't know how many of you here followed the main message of the Paris Agreement. I'll just spend a minute or two on it. As you know, this was supposed to be a historic agreement with 175 or so countries making commitments to reduce emissions. Hooray, hooray. And of course, what we saw was this was not an agreement to reduce emissions. This was an agreement to increase emissions. So we need to be absolutely clear that what was agreed was to reduce emissions based on business as usual trajectories. In other words, emissions will rise more slowly than they would if there were not these national commitments. And the International Energy Agency says, this is not a left-wing organization by any stretch, they said for an emissions reductions agreement as important as this, there was very little by way of emissions reductions. In fact, there's emissions increases right through to 2030. And that's if all of the national commitments put on the table in Paris are actually met. And there's a big question mark how a voluntary agreement with no measures to unlike the WTO, no measures to punish offenders. How is this voluntary agreement going to produce the emissions reductions that are on the table, or the flattening of trajectories, without on the basis of the agreement itself? But what does this tell us? It's not a problem of political will. Many people in the movement say, oh, we need more political will, more political will. I don't see it that way. This is the best capitalism can do while sustaining its regime of growth, accumulation, and consumption. They can't even guarantee those emissions limitations are going to be met, and they can only commit to a voluntary agreement. Now, if we look at the situation, let's go back to the question of where the movement is going globally. And there's so many encouraging things, things that we can take away and take some inspiration and certainly some hope from. Fracking fights alone are proliferating around the world. There's about 14 countries now are doing high volume hydraulic fracturing. And then there's a lot of other countries doing exploratory drilling. But wherever it's happening, there are big fights. Argentina, Bulgaria, Romania, the Ukraine, even in Poland, farmers are fighting back. Australia, South Africa, and Mexico. So these are just a few. UK and Ireland, where fracking is not started yet, but is being proposed. Some exploratory drilling is met with very, very militant resistance. So much so that the gas authorities are wondering that if this is not the biggest problem facing fracking. And this is very encouraging. A lot of people talk about the divestment movement and the fact that funds worth $3.4 trillion have agreed to divest in fossil fuels is a very big part of the movement. But I want to return to that in a moment. We're also seeing at the political level, and I think this is a relatively new development, within the electoral arenas, in Spain, in Greece, with Syriza in Greece. Of course, Syriza's project has been completely derailed. Some people say they derailed themselves, other people say they were derailed by the institutions of the Troika. We can't go into that now, but they were committed to 100% renewable power under public control. Podemos, similarly, energy democracy is in their program. Alberta stood against the oil, the Alberta New Democratic Party won a landslide victory against the oil interest there. In New South Wales and Australia, we're seeing the Greens mostly benefiting at the expense of the Australian Labor Party for fighting coal bed methane and other fossil fuel extraction projects. There's even the Common Man, no sex is intended for me, but the Common Man Party in India, in Delhi in particular, have won landslide victories over air quality issues and want to rein in the fossil fuel companies. And we see the Corbyn election in Britain, leader of the Labour Party, calling, not just winning a landslide in the leadership race, but on a program that included energy democracy, breaking up the big six energy cartels, and for municipalization of power, or remunicipalization of power. And I think these are extremely important developments. One, I think, which is probably of special importance of what's going on in South Africa now. The fights there, political fights, are around what is called the mineral industrial complex, with the ANC really tight with the big extractors and the exporters, and the movement that's grown up there after the Maracana massacre that killed 30 or 40, I can't remember the exact number, of unarmed miners in the platinum sector, has generated a political split which is leading to a new labor formation and a new movement growing up, which is challenging not just the energy companies, but also asserting the need for public renewable power and part of a transition. So it's expressing itself in different ways and in different places. I want to spend a minute or two to talk about the Democratic Party race, because here again there's a big difference between what Bernie Sanders is saying and what Hillary Clinton is saying, and to have this right in the center now of the U.S. discussion on energy is very, very important indeed. Of course, Secretary Clinton is calling for nuclear, clean coal, regulated fracking, but she's being very disingenuous about the fracking question. She says, I will regulate fracking. Well, guess what? You've only got jurisdiction over a third of federal lands, federal and tribal lands. So whatever you do through the Department of Interior is not going to apply for the most part to the remaining 2/3. You can work through the EPA, but that's sort of subject to all sorts of delays and litigation. The EPA has done a very bad job in terms of regulating fracking. But the fundamental problem is they assume that fracking can be regulated, and she's misleading the American public and the world by saying, we can regulate it, look what Colorado has done, when I don't think I need to tell everybody here, there's certain problems intrinsic to fracking. The leakage of methane, not just into water, but into the air, is one reason which means that fracking should be banned on its own, to say nothing about the issue of chemicals and the non-disclosure of chemicals, which is still, even in the states that have tried to regulate, do not require mandatory disclosure of chemicals. Bernie Sanders, of course, is taking it on by confronting the fossil fuel companies, talking about the need to end subsidies and end their political influence. This is a very big opening for the energy democracy discussion, but it's got its weaknesses, and I want to turn to some of those in a moment. Now, just to contrast Obama's election in 2012, when climate was just like shoved out of the discussion, shamefully not attended to by Obama in his run for re-election. But I think there's a couple of problems I'd like to focus in on. One is, let's just take the divestment movement. This number, 3.4 trillion, is very, very misleading. It's a very, very tiny fraction of those pension funds, investments that have actually gone out of fossil fuels. So when the divestment movement says funds representing $3.4 trillion are divesting from fossil fuels, you can be forgiven if you listen to that quickly to think that, $3.4 trillion has moved away from fossil fuels. That's not true. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of that. And I think that there is, even in Paris, there was 350, and I have immense admiration for them. They issued a statement in Paris saying the world is moving away from fossil fuels. Well, if that were true, this is very, first of all, this would mean the role of the movement is different. If market forces, if the general political atmosphere is moving away from fossil fuels, or means we're moving away, then our job as a movement is to keep pushing in the right direction and not to question fundamentally where things are going. But if we look again at the figures, and I think it's good to be optimistic, but we also have to be true to ourselves. Fossil fuels reduced in 2015 by 0.6%, largely due to the collapse of coal use in China. But if we look at fossil fuels emissions related to fossil fuels since the 1990, the benchmark year, it's gone up 61%. And this is during all the times of the discussions on climate change, the Kyoto Agreement, the Copenhagen Accord, and now the Paris Agreement. Through all that time, emissions are going relentlessly upwards, 2 to 3% a year. Yes, it dipped 0.6, but that is not the same as saying the world is going away from fossil fuels. And that, I think, is something that's very sobering, but it's something we have to confront. Also, going back to the question of us becoming a little bit policy wonky, don't repeat, I would suggest, this would be my humble advice, don't repeat phrases like the carbon bubble or stranded assets, because this narrative comes from some of the liberal environmental groups and climate groups. They're very good people, they're working very, very hard, but they're assuming that politically, well below 2 degrees of warming is locked in politically from now until 2030, 2040, and 2050. And yes, under that scenario, there's a lot of big investments will become stranded if that political commitment holds up. The problem is, the Paris Agreement doesn't deliver well below 2 degrees, it delivers 2.7 to 3.5 degrees. That's a completely different scenario. So those stranded assets are not so stranded after all. And if you look at the levels of investments in fossil fuels, notwithstanding the recent slump because of the prices, you're seeing an enormous increase in investment in exploration and also extraction. Far higher than what is going into renewable energy. So I think this is an important point to make on this. Now, closer to home, I think I just want to conclude with a few comments on where my takeaways from the energy democracy debate and how I think we can try to have a conversation in the period ahead. First of all, the project that was started in October 2012, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, came together because there were many unions around the world who were frustrated with the deferential role a lot of unions were playing and large green groups to the idea that the market was basically going to solve the problem. So you saw a lot of liberal environmental groups saying, you know, we've got to incentivize the green economy, incentivize renewable energy. Yes, remove subsidies from fossil fuels, but largely it was a case of moving the goalpost a little bit from fossil fuels towards renewables, and everything was going to fall into place. There was also enormous illusions in the idea of pricing carbon. This is another thing we need to really, really look at it with a very, very critical eye. This idea that carbon trading, which now covers 12% of global greenhouse gas emissions, that's the good news. That means 88% are not covered, duh. And the average price of carbon on these carbon markets around the world is $10 a ton. The European emissions trading system, which is 45% of the EU's economy, was hailed as the flagship of the carbon markets by Nicholas Stern and the World Bank when it was launched in 2006. The price is €7 a ton right now, today. That has no effect on emissions, zero. The World Bank report came out in September, tried to put the best possible spin on it. They said, look, our carbon markets are growing here, there, everywhere, but the same result, 12% covered, 88% not covered. The price is too low to drive change. So the market approaches, we need to be absolutely clear, are failing. And really, if we're going to reach those targets, well below 2 degrees, then the struggle for energy democracy has to be stepped up. But I'm going to conclude by saying I think there's a nascent division in the energy democracy movement. It's a friendly division at this stage between what I call soft energy democracy and a harder version. The soft version for me is the kind of decentralized good, centralized bad. I think that needs to be looked into. There's a lot of good things about decentralized power. But if decentralized power just means someone can afford to put some solar on their roof and sell back to the grid and make some money, what happens to all those people who don't own property? What happens to all those people who don't have upfront capital to put into it? What you then end up is the system cost to sustain the entire power generation system. The burden of that is put on the shoulders of fewer people. And then you get a situation where the right wing and the oil companies and the coal companies saying, you see, these environmentalists don't care about working class people. You're paying more now because those idiots with solar panels on their roof are the ones that are the reason for the increase in your energy costs. That's not true, but that's how it's getting played out in Europe now, where you've got parties at the far right using the idea of decentralized power and feed-in tariffs and solar as a reason to push back on climate policy. So the other question I think we need to grapple with is that co-ops on their own are not the answer. Remunicipalization in places like Germany, Denmark, increasingly in Britain and elsewhere, where public authorities take back parts of the electricity system, particularly the grid, is a far more inspiring example and I think a model for that could be replicated in cities in the United States. It already has in one or two places like Boulder, Colorado, for example. This is a possible way of moving in and democratizing the energy system. I think we need to pay more attention to the reform of the utilities. There is a lot of people doing work in that field, but I think we need to step up a little bit on that. A lot of utilities are forbidden by law to actually do behind-the-meter renewable power. Some of them might actually do it. But either way, those structures are sclerotic, they're undemocratic, they're unaccountable. And I think we need an army of people to move in on those to re-democratize and reclaim the utilities. But I think the key discussion we should be having is how does the role of the state governments play? What is the role in this? I think the historical example of the Rural Electrification Administration in the 1930s is worth revisiting. If you remember, those of you who were around in 1935, I don't see too many people, but in 1935, the FDR set up the Rural Electrification Administration with a $50 million down payment. And they went into, that's my 20 minutes, so I'm going to have to sum up in a second.
You can go a little over if you need to.
Yeah, just a few minutes. So, yeah. This was an approach which I think could be taken up by state level movements and even a national movement. The Rural Electrification Administration, of course, was not renewable power. It was hydro, so that's renewable to a point. And then there was largely later on in the second phase, it was mostly coal-fired generation. But it involved communities. Communities mobilized their own labor. They hired union labor. They hired the unemployed. They went into a radical program of electrification. In 1935, only 5% of rural homes were electrified. By 1955, it was 97%. The American Heritage Foundation complained then that these loans would never ever be paid back. The people who borrowed the money from the government were never going to pay it back. And even the Republican Party then said, well, does it matter? Productivity of labor rose 500%. Living standards rose by a comparable amount. People got electric light. Kids could study at night. Farms could be more productive. You know, it's not a sort of a perfect example of how you do things, but I think the essence of it, and this is where I think the energy democracy movement has to address the question of speed, the question of scale, as much as it needs to question the issue of control. We cannot let the fossil fuel companies do this, but neither can we let the renewable energy companies do this. There's a very, very limited enthusiasm to challenge the renewable energy companies. Look what we got going on in New York State. There's a struggle to get how many megawatts of offshore wind? 30? But, you know, the Jacobson plan for New York State, if I remember, is 40 gigawatts of offshore wind. 40 gigawatts from nothing. Great. It would go a long way to decarbonizing New York State. But we're talking now, we're fighting over 20, 30 megawatts. And as far as I understand it, the negotiation is with a French wind company that wants to come in and sell renewable power at a fixed price for 30 years. That's an expensive way to do it. It's an unpopular way to do it. And what it will mean is because energy is so risky for companies, they go to the bank and they get charged a high level of interest. They want to pass that on then to public authorities who buy power. So this model of the power purchase agreement between governments and private renewable companies, usually large multinationals, is a complete failure. It's been a failure in Europe and it's going to be a failure elsewhere. Public renewable power lowers the interest rates, it lowers the financing, allows us to, within a very short period of time, not only do renewables to scale, pay for it very, very quickly, and then energy literally will be almost free from that point on. And then we can really manage the energy system in a way that is truly equitable and sustainable. But my closing point is this: I don't think we can have a truly democratic energy system without rebuilding a movement for democracy, for socialism, for working people's power all over the world. I think these things go together. The fight against austerity, the fight against attacks on women and people of color and others, this fight is tied up to the climate fight. And if we can answer with programmatically questions like how do we have a truly democratic energy system, then we're playing a part in building that movement. But without that movement, I don't think we're going to succeed. But I applaud everybody right there, now, yesterday, tomorrow, in the trenches, fighting the expansion of fossil fuel companies. We finally put them under pressure. They're losing fights they would normally have won. But this is only the beginning. I encourage us all to engage programmatically on some of these key questions. And thank you for the opportunity to.
Thank you, John.